Good afternoon. My name is Claire Lawrence, and I am one of the project managers of the Development Office of the College of Europe. It's a great pleasure to have you all here for this webinar on EU negotiations, which is linked to our executive education course called Negotiations in Practice. Before I leave the floor to Mr. Paul REIDERMAN, I'd like to give you a few words about the College of Europe. The College of Europe is the first postgraduate institute in European affairs and was founded in 1949. We have two campuses, one in Bruges, you can see a picture of our campus on the screen, and another campus in Natolin in Poland. In addition to our master's degrees programs, the College of Europe offers services to professionals, institutions, and organizations via our development office. This is the department where I work. Our role at the Development Office is to design and organize professional training courses on EU affairs. But we also manage a portfolio of projects, academic cooperation projects, consulting services, and research projects. Now, let's briefly go through today's agenda. So, we will have the pleasure to listen to Paul for approximately 20 minutes. His lecture will focus on negotiations within the EU and more specifically on dynamics and mechanics of the EU Council. Mr. REIDERMAN is Director for Media and Communication in the Council. He is actually also one of our key trainers for our executive education course, Negotiations in Practice. During the lecture, please feel free to send your questions as we will have a 5-minute Q&A session. There is a little box on your screen on the right-hand side. You can type and send your questions from there. But should we receive too many questions, please do not worry. We will answer them by email after the webinar. Finally, after the Q&A, we will have a presentation of our executive education course, Negotiations in Practice, that will take place in November in Bruges. And so, without further ado, let me give the floor to Mr. REIDERMAN.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you everybody who's joining us this afternoon. EU negotiations, then. If we were to think of some words that come to mind when we think of negotiations, then perhaps these would be some of them. Confrontation, discussion, process, meetings, etc. And if we would think of specifically EU negotiations, we could probably add a few others. Late nights, marathons, tense, complex. But what is the essence of a negotiation? It is, I think, in the EU context especially, essentially about decision-making. It's about decision-making between multiple parties. It's a way of attempting to reconcile different points of view where no single party can impose their point of view. And it is, importantly, it's the very essence of how the European Union works, through negotiation. It's in the DNA, if you like, of the European Union. We might not be the quickest decision makers in the world. I think we can think of other political systems that perhaps come to decisions more quickly, perhaps China or Turkey or Russia or some others. But the fact that we make decisions essentially through negotiations is actually one of our strengths, not our weaknesses, because the quality of the decisions that we come to, I think, is often better for them being negotiated. They tend to be more durable decisions, less subject to sudden changes, because we have a decision-making system through negotiation which leaves most of the parties involved content with the outcome on most occasions. So let's take a step back from EU negotiations to look at, if you like, the art of negotiation in a more general sense, because while it's true that negotiations are in the DNA of the European Union, they're present in all of our lives in very many different ways, and therefore they have a relevance to all of us, whatever our professional background is, whether you work in the European Union or not, whether you work with the European Union or not. Because negotiation is actually, it's a fundamental part of human interaction. Interaction between a parent and a child, interaction between a seller and a buyer, even between a husband and a wife, perhaps. In all of those areas, negotiation is a feature. And actually, in modern organizations, which tend to be less hierarchical than previously, negotiation establishes many more things. We have experiences, perhaps, and anecdotes of some of our friends and family members who now set their salaries through negotiation with their employer. In many organizations, your influence is not determined by the position you have, but your negotiating skills. So for all of these reasons, the art of negotiation is an important theme, I think, for all of us in business life, in academic life, in diplomatic life, not just in this narrow area of EU negotiations. And in fact, before my course begins, participants in this week-long session look at some of the essence of the art of negotiation as an introduction to the EU theme. But all art, as I say, needs context. So if we look at move on from the art of negotiating, and we consider the skills, fine, but skills are not enough, because we need to know in a negotiation what skills to deploy and what skills to deploy when. And that depends on understanding the context, the setting. And here, the particular setting is the European Union and its institutions. It's a very particular, unique context. Every negotiation has to be anchored in the environment of the negotiation. And here you have an environment with multiple players. Some of them are state players, the 28 member states of the Union, and some of them are institutional players, the Council itself, the Commission, the Parliament, and so on. And so here, in this photograph you see here, you have a concentration of negotiations which is probably unparalleled geographically anywhere in the world. In this single photograph you see all three of those institutions, and it really is the core physically, geographically of the EU's negotiations. What then of the European Union context? Well, in my lecture, I think I begin normally by explaining the historical, political origins of negotiations in the EU context and in the context of the EU's decision making. We look at some ways in which the EU differs very fundamentally from other negotiating bodies, like the UN, like a negotiation perhaps with a trade union or an employer. And we also look at the particularity of the Council. The Council, in this classic triangle of three EU institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. Of those three institutions, more than the other two, the Council is characterized by a culture of negotiation. And why is that? It's partly, I think, because the other institutions come to a view, certainly with negotiation being part of the process, but also, especially in the case of the Parliament, more through a voting culture than a negotiating culture. So we talk about the Council and the nature of the Council, the fact that the Council is at the same time an executive and a legislature, the fact that the Council arranges its work on a sectoral basis, but legally is a single, coherent and whole institution. But we also try to understand the Council as a negotiating machine. what do I mean by that? Well, I think a machine where at one end of the machine we feed in some issues which can be both politically and technically extremely complex, but where this machine delivers, sometimes after quite some time, sometimes after less time, but where this machine delivers much more often than not solutions at the other end. So how does this negotiating machine work? What explains its historic success in that respect? To explain that success, I think we have to distinguish between theory and practice. And it was, I think, Einstein who said, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice they're not. In the council's case, I think that translates as meaning, well, you need to read the rules of the game in order to understand the game of negotiations in the council. But reading and understanding the rules of the game are not enough. And we shouldn't really be surprised by that. I mean, after all, none of us would really imagine why somebody could become a good golfer or somebody who's good at soccer by simply reading the rules of golf or the rules of soccer. You've got to get out there and you need to play the game. You need to know the rules, but you will never really get good at the game unless you play the game. What about this machine then, this negotiating machine that is the council? Well, I think one of the best ways to understand it is, like most modern machines, it's something that combines two quite different aspects. The first is it's a machine with hardware. Let's describe it as hardware, like a computer has hardware. And in the council's case, the hardware is composed of rules, a set of rules. All of those rules you can find publicly available. They can be found in the treaties of the European Union and in the Council's own rules of procedure. So we look at those rules, at that hardware, to try to understand who are the members of this institution. How do they act together? What are the mechanics that bring them together at different levels of negotiation? What are the essential elements? And what are the basic processes by which this machine works? But just as it's very difficult to understand how a computer works if you only understand the hardware, so it is with the council. Because the council, if it's a negotiating machine, is a machine that has both hardware and software. What do I mean by the software? Well, just as in a computer, it's the software that really breathes life into this machine. It explains better than rules can how the actors interact with each other. The software of the council is a political and administrative culture that helps you understand how these actors work together. So during the course of the lectures that I give here in the college, I focus quite a lot on that culture and explaining it and demonstrating it to participants. Why? Because really this is the part that you cannot easily read. Whichever textbook you go to, you'll find the rules, but it's much more difficult to get a grasp of this political, administrative culture. If you can't read it, how can you get access to it? Well, you can ask somebody who's been a witness to that culture, and I'm one of those witnesses. But even better than asking somebody who's a witness is to witness it yourself. witnessing firsthand this culture is really the best way to understand it.
The first question is from Jean-Baptiste. So let me read the question. According to Article 2093, the EC can force member states to vote by unanimity if the Council amendments go too far from the EC proposal. What about QMV, qualified majority voting system, as a rule in co-decision?
Well, before the simulation and during the simulation, we look at the voting rules of the Council. And this is one of the ways in which the European Union is fundamentally different from bodies like the United Nations. The fact that for most policy areas, when we get to a voting stage, voting is by a qualified majority rather than by everybody having to adopt a decision by consensus. We also look at this issue that Jean-Baptiste has raised about, well, what happens if the member states are opposed to the policy proposal of the Commission. If the Commission is not ready to change its proposal, then that would require the unanimity within the Council. In practice, that unanimity on most policy issues is very difficult to find. It's not unheard of, but it's unusual. And even if there was unanimity of the Council to change the proposal of the Commission always has the nuclear weapon, if you like, of withdrawing its proposal entirely. If it feels that its proposal is going to be sufficiently denatured by a unanimity in the Council, then the Commission can simply withdraw its proposal. The simulations that I do here with the college, we base them on qualified majority, simply because that reflects the reality for the vast majority of negotiations that take place.
Okay, thank you. Our second question is from Raman. Have you ever faced a situation where there was no visible solution?
Raman, yes. That is a situation that I faced as a witness, or as to negotiations, or as an advisor to the presidency. But sometimes that changes. Sometimes there's an element that comes into the equation that wasn't there before, and a dossier that was apparently blocked for a long time can become unblocked. Sometimes it's a change of circumstances. Sometimes events happen that mean that the participants in a negotiation who did not see any urgency to an issue, something happens in the real world which convinces them that that urgency is there. Perhaps there's a change of government in one or more of the member states, so the positions of the governments can change. Perhaps a new council presidency has an entirely fresh and different approach to the question, and works on a very different kind of solution. So some negotiations stay blocked forever. We have examples of policy initiatives that have never been agreed, but more often something changes to unblock the situation.
Okay, thank you. Once again, Paul, thank you very much for this lecture. We see that there are other questions, but as I said, don't worry, we'll send you an email after the webinar with some feedback. Now, as promised, let me give you some details about our course. We have been running this negotiations in practice course for over 10 years, and the next edition of this course will take place from the 13th to the 17th of November in Bruges. When we designed this course, our objective, and Paul mentioned this earlier, was to transfer know-how and self-confidence for participants to then feel comfortable when they're involved in negotiation processes. Being a good negotiator requires a number of skills, including understanding the decision-making processes and rules, being a strong communicator, being able to design and implement a negotiating strategy, using negotiation tactics, and being able to respond to other sides' tactics. So basically, the idea of the program is to cover all these aspects in 5 days. So as you can see on the screen, this is the program. We have a number of interactive sessions aiming at examining the theory and practice of negotiations. In addition, we have very practical sessions, exercises on negotiation tactics, techniques, but also other exercises to enhance communication skills. And the last day of the course is dedicated to the real-life simulation that Paul described during his lecture, where participants take over the role of negotiators in the council. So as you can see, it's a dense program, but it's also very comprehensive. And so those who are interested, please note that registrations are open until 23rd of October. For more information on the course, please visit our website www.coleurope.eu/negotiations. And to find out more information about our other courses, please visit our executive education website. You can see the link is on your screen. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention, participation. Paul, thank you again. We hope to see you all in Bruges very soon.